Well, I try to get all the information I can, and ultimately we're searching for the truth. So you're in gathering mode, you get everything you can, and then you worry about what you'll do with it later.
I think that when you are a public person, public official in particular, you have a lesser expectation of privacy, or you ought to anyway. I mean, the president might disagree with that. But I do think that they're fair game. A question that you'll probably ask is, well, the daughter isn't running for governor. Mm-hmm. And that's clearly what makes it complicated. That's something that you as a journalist will have to wrestle with.
In this case, in this hypothetical, I would say, if there's a police report that has domestic violence incident related to it, and there is, as you mentioned, on the record, law enforcement that was involved, he's running for governor, and there is a public right to know. So you really just have to tread as carefully as you can. And it might be, unfortunately, there might not be an opportunity to not to minimize harm as much as you would like to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry, if I could just add to that. One of the more interesting things is typically if you're covering a case where there's an allegation of sex assault or anything of that nature, you would typically seek the permission of that person who was the accuser to use their name. Right. Or if you are writing about an incident, you either make you make it known whether the alleged victim or the accuser was known to the alleged perpetrator or not known. But you would work very hard to make sure that you did not identify the person. The problem is, in this case, in the hypothetical, you have a mother and you have a child, and the child is not. You have a mother who's making an executive decision on behalf of her child, saying, "Here are these public documents. Here is this allegation," and sort of. I mean, because of the age of the child, she's not really given any space to speak out at this point about
her own decision.
Exactly, it's one that's been made for her by her mother.
We go through some of these acts all the time when there are victims of sex abuse, and we will say the victim was known to the perpetrator. Oftentimes, that is journalistic shorthand for that is the perpetrator's stepdaughter or something, right? I mean, we actually have, in the journalistic effort to not reveal the identity of who the sex crimes victim is, there are little signals that are given to the readers of who this might be. And in a small community,
it's easy to figure out.
It's easy to figure out.
Mm-hmm. I probably wouldn't go out with it before knowing. Would you, Anjay?
Yeah, I think I'd hold it, but something that we all need to consider is this media universe that we're all operating in. I no longer assume that I'm the only one who knows something.
Right.
Mm-hmm. In your scenario, I mean, it's entirely conceivable that it's going to get around in social media, that it's going to, perhaps even get out in some other form. In a newspaper website or some kind of alt-right website. It could be anywhere. So that's part of your calculus too, because do you want to be called out after the fact and say, well, you sat on this information, you knew about the allegations. Why don't you put the allegations out there and then put out the judge's decision on it? And then let people draw their own conclusion? Or do you withhold the whole thing? I mean, that's obviously the debate that you have to enter into.
That's the question. So you put your finger right on it. When you have reason to believe that the charges were unproven, maybe it happened, but not proven.
Exactly.
That's about as close as you can get in your calculus. It's almost 50-50.
I would say I want to embrace the development because I want to now learn a lot more about it and find out if one side is making up horrible things to muddy someone who doesn't, for their own purposes and their own very bad purposes. This isn't something that you just go, oh, I guess it's not true and forget about it. This is a reason to jump all over it and find out why they're making up horrible things about somebody. I mean, at the AP, we have a whole fact check department now that, we've made fact checking a big part of our company, and it's become very important with the labels that are being thrown on the media right now.
I hate to say this, but as a trial court judge in family court, in a pending case, I would never speak to a reporter at all.
This girl is about to be scorched for life.
Well,
She's got to go to school the next day, and he's going to promise you that if you tell, i.e., what's true, namely that your colleague, or according to the records, the charge was not substantiated, can you save it, and you might be able to save this girl. Would that tip it at all, or would you just say, I'm sorry, we don't want to break the rule, it's an inviolate rule, we don't break it, sorry?
for us, we're always balancing the rights of the parties, including the children, as well as what we firmly recognize and support as the right of the public to know. Family court proceedings are different. For the first time, really just in a few short years ago, were family court proceedings ever open to the public. But now there's still a lot of protection. And what is primary, I think, for the trial judge is the fairness of the process. And as long as that process within the courtroom is as fair as it can be to all parties, that's what really matters the most. So for us to make, for I think a single judge to say this is so important that I'm going to break all the rules is, I think, a dangerous
What
decision
about the
to make.
point that Judge Rosenblatt is making, that the fairness to this child might suggest, would you ever consider speaking off the record to a reporter to say, I think you're headed in the wrong direction there, this child is...
Well, for one thing, the fact that I may have not, determined an allegation to be unfounded, there are plenty of other people, including the governor himself, who will know that and who can point to that without my having to inject myself into the situation.
The lawyers down the line, as you said, the governor himself, all kinds of people would be trumpeting this way before a judge ever had to pass this question through their head. And I gotta say, I've been in the federal court for 26 years. I've talked to a lot of judges in both social and, all kinds of settings. I've never had a judge say something inappropriate or even something along those lines, revealing something or say, you ought to look into this, It just
happen.
doesn't happen.
First, my obligation is to my client, right? I don't have an obligation to tell the truth to the public. I don't have an obligation to the electorate. I have an obligation to my client. So I am thinking about what are my client's objectives in the divorce proceeding in which I've been hired to counsel and represent. There's a financial interest. There's an interest in the child. Maybe my client in this scenario certainly has some other agenda which may or may not be compatible with those two interests that are front and center in a divorce proceeding. So the first thing I'm going to do is counsel my client about how to manage this situation, because I'll tell you, when I read this hypothetical, there's some things I know. My matrimonial judge knows that this came from the wife. It doesn't matter how many people you put in that chain, it's going to, that albatross is going to be hung around her neck in the divorce proceeding. So you can go through a PR person and whoever you want, she's going to hold responsibility that it came out.
So Judge Steyer would be sore at you right out of the box. You'd have a judge deciding it who is not fond of what you're doing. That's a consideration, right? That's one of the considerations.
Well, and from the judge's point of view, it's not just that I'm not fond of what she's doing. My concern then becomes is she looking out for the best interests of her child? I mean, this is a custody matter, and so when I'm balancing the fitness of the parents, one of the factors that I am going to consider is the parent going to put his or her interests before the interests of the child? So in that regard, it is relevant to me.
And so because you're the matrimonial judge, the family court judge in this case, you're going to be carrying narrowly about that when she's actually also, the wife, the first lady of the state of Candor, is actually, you might say, caring about the citizens of the state of Candor and trying to prevent them from having a governor for a second term who's a child abuser. But you can't look at that. You really need to just narrowly focus on the case at hand.
Well, for the most part, that's true, but I also have to think of the public right to know. It's just that in the family court, in the matrimonial situation, the laws, again, I'm assuming some similarity with the laws of the state of New York, the laws protect the children, the victims or the alleged victims of any kind of sexual abuse or misconduct from that sort of thing. So the balancing in that case is skewed, I think, pretty heavily toward the child.